So last time we started on the story of the opening of Walt Disney World, which was not only the story of how the resort was developed, but also the story of how power centers within the Disney company began to shift in the years following the death of Walt Disney. One significant area of influence, the WED designers, was overseen by Dick Irvine. Another area, the operations managers, those individuals who managed Disneyland and would later manage Disney World, was overseen by Dick Nunes. Though Dick Nunes initially worked on the Florida project largely from the West Coast, as that was the planning center for the resort, by the fall of 1970, like other Disney executives, he could see how the Florida project was beginning to unravel. Quote, J.B. Allen, the contractor overseeing construction, was reporting to us that they couldn't meet the deadline. Nunes said, couldn't have the place ready for the October 1st opening. Well, that was just not an option for us. We had to open on time. The well was dry. We'd run out of money. The problems, however, were larger than Nunes initially believed, with members of the J.B. Allen team explaining in detail to Roy Disney the difficulties on site. At one crucial meeting, Roy Disney fired Johnny Allen and his construction company from the Disney site and made the unusual decision to bring the entire project under Disney's management, though Disney itself had little experience overseeing construction projects of this size. Once Johnny Allen was given notice, Admiral Joe Fowler called Pete Markham, one of the men who had proven their loyalty to the Disney organization. We have just fired J.B. Allen, Fowler said, and we have formed the Buena Vista Construction Company, and you are it. But the shift away from J.B. Allen would create a need for greater company involvement on the Florida site, roles that would further shift the power dynamic between the designers and the operations team. In October 1970, less than a year before the resort was scheduled to open, J.B. Allen removed its team from the Florida site, and Pete Markham hired his own supervisors and crew chiefs in an attempt to wrangle the project back on track. The Buena Vista Construction Company formed with leased equipment and a range of subcontractors and outside construction companies, a loosely arranged army of laborers. But even these efforts by themselves were unlikely to put construction back on track to make the October 1st deadline. Disney executives knew that the company should have a stronger representation on site. Joe Fowler would spend more time in Florida, but at the age of 77, he couldn't be expected to help manage multiple work crews on a site that was many square miles. During a flight from Florida to California, Disney vice presidents Don Tatum and Card Walker explored individuals who might fill this role. At this time, with Roy Disney again expressing a wish to retire, Tatum and Walker were expected to rise within the company and take roles respectively overseeing the company's business and creative centers. But this wouldn't happen if the Florida project turned out to be a mess. On this flight, they reviewed a range of issues that would affect the Florida project, from construction to installation, from hiring to training. Some of these problems, they knew, would improve once more WED designers were on site to install attractions, review color schemes, and approve craft work. But the project needed someone to organize the different divisions and manage work timelines, making sure the resort, or at least as much of the resort as possible, was ready for the public at the start of October. For this position, they felt that Dick Nunes might be a reasonable choice, as he had overseen thousands of employees for years at Disneyland. Once they arrived at this plan, Tatum and Walker asked Nunes his thoughts on the project. Dick, what do you think, they said. Can we get open by October 1st? By this point, like many members of the Disney company, Nunes was tired, his inner resources stretched thin. Frankly, he replied, from what I've seen under present circumstances, I don't think so. Walker and Tatum then asked what, in Nunes' opinion, would move the development back on track. Nunes told them it could be done, quote, only if we throw all the resources of the company into it. In other words, if he was going to take on this role, he wanted more control of the money and the ability to make decisions on site. The following Monday, Nunes was called in for a meeting where Walker and Tatum agreed to focus the total energies of the company on the Florida project if Nunes would help oversee its completion. If Nunes was partially loaned from Disneyland operations to this new Disney-based construction effort, he would be able to request personnel from all areas of the company. He would be able to work outside of budgets and the formal budget approval process. It would also mean that he would be on site in Florida and would need to leave his responsibilities at Disneyland to others. Nunes recalled that he, quote, left Disneyland with their total backing. He delegated much of the responsibility of the California park to division heads and began to pull in personnel from all areas of the company, design, operations, crafts, to finish Florida. Or as one longtime cast member would put it, quote, to ramrod the completion of the resort. Around the studio, as he transferred top employees to the Florida project, his group was casually, perhaps derogatorily, known as the Nunes Raiders, a mass migration of California personnel to Florida. Quote, we literally stripped down other divisions of the Disney company, Nunes explained. The studio designed Disneyland with many transferred employees earmarked to stay in Florida for months after it opened. At the urging of Roy Disney, Bob Matheson, a longtime Disney employee, helped establish a relocation benefits program to provide for those willing to move. Quote, we went to other companies and studied their transfer programs. We looked at financial aspects since it was more expensive to live in Southern California than Orlando. After investigating the data for weeks, quote, we came up with a really good proposal, he said, that we felt was workable and fair and was better than any other company's similar policy. The team, led by Matheson, presented their materials to Roy, explaining how other companies assisted employees over the course of a move. After reviewing the materials, Roy simply shook his head, then quietly said, no, I want to do more for these people. They're leaving their homes and their friends. With this, Matheson went back through the proposal page by page, adding benefits and including substantially higher rates of compensation. Beyond money, Roy believed that those who worked closely on the project should receive support and credit. In part, this was related to a sense of fairness that underpinned his personal sense of morality, and in part, this was related to a desire that Disney World extend traditions started by Walt at Disneyland. At one point, Marty Sklar sent Roy a memo explaining that the company might reconsider placing named windows on Main Street, listing the lead designers, engineers, and architects as Walt had done at Disneyland. Quote, you always offend people, Sklar explained. You can't possibly get everybody's name who should be on a window. So we made the recommendation that we should use fictitious companies and fictitious names, just dress the windows basically like you do on a movie set. Roy's reply was direct and succinct. No, he said, I want to do it like Walt did at Disneyland. Once in Florida, Nunes, along with Admiral Fowler and General Potter, looked to manage the project like a military operation. In this, Nunes likely drew on his ROTC experience years earlier while a student at USC. Marvin Davis recalled how Nunes and his team of assistants moved about the property. Quote, out the window, we saw this helicopter land, and Nunes gets out and he has about 5 guys with him. They all get out and they march over. They are all behind Nunes, so help me. He started out just like General Patton would do it. Everybody almost saluted him. The comparison to Patton, a strong-willed general who moved troops into Germany to help end World War II, was partially inspired by an extremely popular biopic released the previous year about the life of General Patton, in which actor George C. Scott played the title character. Nunes apparently warmed to this image, that of a leader struggling to manage a difficult situation. Quote, "Somebody gave Nunes a military-style helmet," Davis recalled. The helmet, at least in its shape and composition, was nearly identical to the one that George C. Scott wore in the movie, except across the white painted front, in large black letters, it read, "Number 1 SOB." And it wasn't just someone that gave the helmet to Nunes, it was a gift from construction crews on site. Quote, "And he actually wore it around a couple of times," Davis said. "He would go from one end of the lot to the other in a helicopter. Everybody else drove." Nunes' shirts were pressed with military starch. He walked with direction and purpose. When he answered the radio, he said, "Number 1 SOB here." It was a nickname the crew gave him, one that he liked. It was, to say the least, an unusual move to embrace a firm military identity, especially as actual military brass. General Potter and Rear Admiral Fowler oversaw many aspects of site preparation and construction. For some at WED, it further deepened their sense that he was in fact his old nickname, the Stormtrooper, a person trying to shove a project forward with force and a deep sense of order. This type of regiment was in direct opposition to how many designers worked forward with their own projects, relying on inspiration, reflection and revision, and a contemplation of aesthetic goals. But even Marvin Davis, one of Nunes' harshest critics, admitted that he, quote, "was probably the best man for the job because he drove a tight ship." But there was one aspect of the helmet that Nunes didn't initially understand. The construction workers and contractors who had given him the gift did so not only to acknowledge that he was a demanding leader, but also so they could spot him whenever he was approaching a work crew. That white helmet, with its unique set of black letters, was easy to pick out of a crowd at 100 or even 200 yards away as he approached a work site. As Nunes' role grew more important on the Florida project, Dick Irvine sought to delineate his role as equally important or perhaps more so than that of Nunes and the other operations managers. In essence, Irvine wanted to ensure that in terms of project development, Nunes focused on construction, hiring, and training, and didn't change design plans approved by WED. Dick Irvine explained to Nunes that he didn't want Nunes putting forward any orders to change any presently approved plans, particularly if those changes were focused entirely on the needs of park operations. "Dick," Nunes said, "there will be change orders." As if to demonstrate his new authority, Nunes issued a change order shortly after returning to Florida in this new role. Quote, "So I get to the main gate, and there's a little bit of a problem," Nunes recalled. A crew was framing in an area for raised cement planting beds, which would limit guest movement, particularly on crowded days. These planting areas, placed where they were, would encourage guests to slow down or perhaps stop entirely just after they entered the park. Quote, "So I called Dick Irvine," Nunes said, "and I said, 'Dick, you have to come out and look at this.'" During those weeks, Nunes carried a portable tape recorder on which he dictated directions for various teams. He thought it was important to record these notes as he spotted problems, even though a portable tape recorder in 1971 would have been nearly the size of a shoebox and weighed a couple of pounds. His recorded comments were often filled with direct and colorful language, which his secretary, Kathy, cleaned up as she turned them into memos which she distributed overnight. Nunes would later say, quote, "We got all our energies going in one direction after that, but we knew it was going to be a race." One of his lieutenants, Bob Matheson, recalled that during these months, Nunes would become flustered attempting to manage multiple projects. One afternoon, Matheson saw Nunes grab his two-way radio, thinking he was grabbing the tape recorder. To local airways, he ordered, quote, "That so-and-so better get his ass in gear and get such-and-such painted." Matheson remained quiet as Nunes barked out his commands, but when he was done, he said, "Dick, You just gave the note on the two-way radio." Then there was silence until Nunes, his voice touched with anger and reticence, said, "Oh." Matheson made sure not to tell the crew about Nunes's mistake because by then, small pockets of resentment against Nunes were strong enough to make a story like this a property-wide myth. Almost any small problem, according to Matheson, made Nunes, quote, go ballistic. Another of Nunes's managers saw his anxieties and anger from a slightly different perspective. Quote, "You gave Nunes a task, and you knew he was going to get it done, and it didn't matter how many people he mowed down getting there, but he was going to get there." In this regard, he was very much like General Patton, a man determined to finish a job. As construction moved toward summer, one of the points of concern involved the two hotels, the Polynesian and the Contemporary. At this time, Disney had no experience with hotel construction and management. In Anaheim, the Disneyland Hotel was owned and operated by the Rather Corporation on land leased from Disney. A similar situation was arranged in Florida, with U.S. Steel building the hotels on land that Disney owned. As at Disney, executives at U.S. Steel regularly flew from their home offices in Pittsburgh to check the progress of the two hotels, but over time they became skeptical that the construction crew might not be able to open the Magic Kingdom on October 1st, even if Disney now managed the site. Their skepticism, in part validated by the problems with J.B. Allen, required Roy Disney, Dick Nunes, and others to meet with them at their corporate offices. Quote, "We went to Pittsburgh," Nunes explained, "to have a meeting with their top executives." The CEO of U.S. Steel said, "We're really concerned about the opening of the Magic Kingdom. Why do we have to have the hotels open if you aren't going to have the Magic Kingdom open?" Roy turned to Nunes and asked, "Are we going to open on October 1st, 1971? "Sir, we're going to open on October 1st, 1971, Nunes said. Then, making light of the situation, Nunes added that they would open even if they needed to recast some construction equipment presently on site as temporary rides, even, quote, "if we have to use the bulldozers for capacity." At this, people in the room chuckled. "Okay, there's the answer," Roy said, "and we expect to have the hotels opened." With this, U.S. Steel focused on the opening timeline, attempting to bring the work now behind schedule up to date. But elsewhere on the Florida site, other issues were beginning to boil up into serious problems. The ongoing skirmishes between Dick Irvine's design team and construction managers weren't simply about usability. These disagreements at times were also about aesthetics. Pete Markham, manager of Disney's construction division, recalls an incident where he was reviewing progress on Main Street with wet art director Bill Martin, who was displeased with the placement of a window, believing it was too close to the door. At this point, the window was framed, but the wall wasn't finished. Markham asked one of the construction foremen to show Martin the approved plans. "I don't care what the plans say," Martin replied. "It's too close." Markham, understanding that resistance would lead to a long disagreement, simply turned to the foreman and said, "Okay, Stu, move the window over 3 inches. But as the team began to adjust the window, Martin realized that the move would shift the building's visual balance. Instead, he changed his order. "No, leave the window alone. It's good. Move the door." In Nunes's view, the tension between his people and various art directors arose from a desire to be practical. Quote, "Dick Irvine wanted things done his way, his colors, pavers, his whatever," Jim Cora recalled, and Dick Nunes was focused on getting open. And some things that Dick Irvine wanted to do would have taken more time. And Nunes was afraid of the changes eating up the calendar. Pete Markham put it more directly, quote, "That's the way the art directors work. They see it and that's it. They don't care what the engineers and the architects do." Most of the disagreements concerned construction in the Magic Kingdom, which in 1971 was the centerpiece jewel of the resort. Quote, Nunes always felt that pressure, Jim Cora explained. It was always hurry, hurry, hurry. Dick Irvine wanted to get it right and didn't want to hurry, and so they were always at odds over something. At times, the disagreements between Nunes and Irvine spilled out on the construction site and in meeting rooms. Quote, Roy became the arbitrator, the final word, Jack Lindquist explained, or he took both of them, banged heads together real hard and said, I don't want to hear any more about the problems. I want to get the job accomplished. Another manager, Bob Allen, recalled that by June and July, the morning meetings, quote, kept getting earlier and earlier. Finally, we got word to be in the meeting room at 6 a.m. Some of the managers, now sleeping on site, arrived in their night clothes. One even brought a razor. Nunes took to sleeping on a cot on property, much as Walt had done in the days leading up to the opening of Disneyland. Quote, we had a couple hundred key management people and experts on the site now, Nunes recalled. There was no discussion of changing the opening date. In ways, this heightened military approach proved effective, even if it made Nunes himself for some a target of ridicule. For example, when Nunes directed advertising executive Jack Lindquist to somehow find enough laying red cement to finish Main Street, Lindquist went so far as to fly to New Jersey to arrange a shipment trucked down to Florida. But Nunes' approach with its business hierarchy did not sit well with all Disney employees, particularly those wed artists and architects more accustomed to less regulated approaches to their work. It also didn't sit well with longtime Disney executives such as construction manager Admiral Joe Fowler. He was one of the few who found ways to sidestep Nunes' new authority by looking directly to Roy Disney to sign off on budget adjustments. Quote, Dick had a real responsibility, Fowler would later say. He had to make sure things dovetailed into his operation. But in terms of who held the upper hand between the two of them, Fowler also understood that money conferred authority. His construction budget came directly from the studio, and with that money, he was able to sign off on projects with or without Nunes' approval. In explaining how he worked around Nunes to get some projects done his way, Fowler would slyly point to himself, saying, quote, I used Nunes' team without their realizing it. I had them working for me. At times, to get Roy's ear, managers alluded to their closeness with Walt, expressing they understood what Walt would have done. Members of the WED group understood that their leader, Dick Irvine, had a strong history with Disneyland that went back to its earliest days in 1952 when Walt met with Irvine and others to dream up his amusement park. Irvine had also worked for the Disney studio in the 1940s. With this, the connections between Irvine and Walt were clear and substantial. In contrast, as WED designer Mark Davis recalled, Nunes had more difficulty supporting his connections to Walt as equal to those of Irvine. For months, according to Davis, Nunes rummaged through studio files hoping to find a photo of himself with Walt to visually solidify his closeness to the old man. The punchline, according to Davis, was that Nunes could find no such photo. But beyond the on-site squabbles over who had final authority, a more serious problem was developing for Irvine. At the age of 61, after endless battles at the studio and in Florida, he was experiencing heart trouble, a pain in his chest he could no longer ignore, something like a dot of fire that never completely went away. According to his doctor, the stress from the massive Disney project was too much for him. Even Disney Vice President Card Walker understood the pressure of work, quote, probably had a great deal to do with his failure in health. In August, doctors directed Irvine to leave Florida and rest in California. I have a problem, Irvine told other managers. The doctor says I have to go home. At home, his children were surprised to see how much their father had changed over such a short time. One of his daughters recalled that he, quote, came back from Florida so sick. With the removal of Irvine, most of the Disney team was now required to line up behind Nunes. Because of this power shift, whisper campaigns, perhaps started by creative groups, expressed discontent with Nunes' management style. One slogan was that Disney World property would be all right, quote, once the Nunes wears off. Another slogan, in reaction to Nunes' firm managerial style, was, quote, Dick Nunes before he dicks you. One employee even printed one of these slogans onto small lapel buttons. Those behind these smear campaigns were likely upset that Nunes had won the battle with Irvine by default, not with superior ideas or a stronger sense of organization, but simply because Irvine's health no longer allowed him to work on site. Despite the closet grumblings, despite the mock military environment, most everyone could see the Nunes strategy, bit by bit, was producing results. He was moving the project, at least for the most part, back on schedule. As Nunes gained control of the site, he looked to manage areas technically outside of Disney's control, including crews hired by U.S. Steel. At one point, Nunes explained that he wanted more authority over the hotels. To open as a functioning resort, Disney would need the hotels to open on time as well. Quote, we want to come over and help you, Nunes told construction managers hired by U.S. Steel. We'll just forget about the bookkeeping. Let's just get it opened. Despite a sense of collegiality between Disney and U.S. Steel managers, Nunes took a stern approach when talking with construction workers. One day while walking through the Contemporary, he passed a worker who snidely told his friend, there goes one of the blankety-blank supervisors. Hearing this, Nunes turned around and replied, I'm not one of those blankety-blank supervisors. I'm one of those blankety-blank executives. Now, what is your blankety-blank problem? When the situation cooled, Nunes explained that he was trying to oversee a project in which they could all have pride, a project whose eventual accomplishments would reflect well on workers' families as well. Van France, the man who had originally hired Nunes, initially didn't believe Dick's managerial style would work in Florida. Quote, nor did I have that much faith in what I called the Nunes Mafia, France explained. He flew out about 100 people back there from various branches of the Disneyland operation, all handpicked to work for Dick with total loyalty. Charles Boyer, a Disney artist, even painted a portrait of Nunes wearing olive green military clothes. In it, Nunes, with a walkie-talkie, binoculars, and riding crop, stands fist on hips before the American flag. A shirt patch and belt buckle feature the image of Mickey Mouse. With determination, Nunes stares clear-eyed out at viewers, just like George C. Scott did in the movie Patton. Quote, the pre-opening push was about as bad, maybe worse than it was for Disneyland, Van France recalled. Unlike Disneyland, where the project only included an amusement park and parking lot, the Florida site also included multiple hotels, a wilderness campground and village, lakes, and various recreation areas. Most areas, including at least portions of the campground, needed to be finished before the resort could be presented to the press, from buildings to walkways, from show areas to the lagoon. Disneyland Transplant, Bob Penfield recalled, quote, we settled into a pattern of working 6 to 7 days a week since there was a ton of work to complete. Managers transferred from Disneyland and the studio lived in hotel rooms and apartments, often 2 to a bedroom. Construction workers from all over the South arrived at the resort looking for work. Roadside restaurants and catering trucks sprung up to serve food. It was, quote, the middle of nowhere, one transferred Disneyland manager recalled. There wasn't any local supply chain. Everything was shipped in from the West Coast. Aside from work, those who had recently moved to Florida had little to do, as Orlando was largely an agricultural city without much nightlife. They saw movies, they watched TV, they slept off the weariness. One person remembered that those from Disneyland gathered at the ABC Liquor Lounge, a combination liquor store and bar where all drinks, quote, cost 50 cents, beer or Crown Royale. Another recalled they, quote, went to Windermere and drank there, or Johnny's Place, just down the road from the construction site. In terms of preparing the resort for visitors, nature continued to be one of the largest obstacles. Though the natural environment needed to be protected in terms of water, wetland areas, and landmass, it also needed to be managed in terms of guest comfort, specifically mosquitoes and deer flies. With large bodies of water on property, Disney executives understood that the insect population would prove problematic unless managed. Quote, a bitten tourist wouldn't enjoy his stay as much as the unbitten, publicist Charlie Ridgway explained. The company hired entomologist Fred Harden and pest control expert Stan Young to develop a system to keep insect populations away from tourist areas. To start with, they looked for natural ways to control insects, for example, by stocking the lake with largemouth bass. When the natural systems didn't fully manage the problems, they focused on ultra-low volume spray methods to dust the ground with aerosol-like mists of malathion and dibron in quantities so low as to not irritate people using the grounds for recreation. Specifically, Harden believed that they would be able to use, quote, 1/2 ounce per fluid acre compared to the gallons per acre under conventional spraying, thereby minimizing the amount of pesticide used in guest areas. Though Harden and Young hadn't yet tested low-volume spraying techniques, they planned to do so in the coming months, both by air and by truck. But they both agreed that, quote, the real test will come when the sprawling theme park clicks its gates open to 20,000 to 30,000 or more visitors each day. During the second week of July, Governor Askew of Florida visited the site. He had lunch with Roy Disney, Joe Fowler, Card Walker, and Dick Nunes, where they discussed the roadway problems leading to the park, as Disney officials were concerned that infrastructure overseen by the state was not yet large enough to accommodate the crowds they believed would arrive by car later in the year. The governor explained that the state had been investing $1 million a year since 1965 to build up roads around the resort and suggested that these efforts would continue into the future, though Disney executives still didn't believe that the current road system would accommodate the type of crowds and workforce they believed would descend on the resort shortly after it opened. After lunch, dressed in a white shirt and hard hat, the governor toured the construction site to find the park far from finished. A station wagon carried him from the entrance road to the resort area. Neither of the hotels were finished. The Contemporary in particular had a long ways to go, as the monorail track still needed to be laid through the interior of the massive A-frame building. Some facades on Main Street were complete, but their interiors were empty. Other areas of the park were open construction zones. Bulldozers moved over mounds of sand, trying to level out the ground for landscaping. Quote, pyramids of piping and stacks of lumber punctuated the tour route, one reporter noted. The governor's tour ended at the monorail roundhouse, about a quarter-mile behind the partially built Fantasyland, where Joe Fowler explained how Disney World would showcase new transportation technology, including a monorail train much wider than the one presently used at Disneyland. At this point, Fowler explained that they had only taken the monorail out on the beam for a few brief tests with mixed results. When the governor asked for a ride, Fowler looked at the other men in the tour party, then begrudgingly nodded his head. We can take you on a train ride, but we can't guarantee you getting back. A complicated piece of machinery doesn't always work its first time out. From there, Fowler and the governor walked up into the roundhouse and powered on a monorail. They rode it with the wheels turning slowly over the cement beam from the spur line out onto the main loop. They ventured as far as the upslope that elevated the train to the Contemporary Hotel, then stopped, as the beamway ended there, like a long cement plank dropping off into nothing. From their vantage point, they could see hundreds of people working on the hotel. The restaurant at the top wasn't yet walled in, Though upper floors had modular hotel rooms inserted into their steel slots, many lower floors were mostly open beams. Long-reach cranes were positioned on both sides of the structure. Around it, there was no landscaping of any kind, just open dirt along with a few trees. Together, the Disney team and the governor's people looked out at the structure. Then they put the train in reverse and began gliding back to the roundhouse. The governor, as well as everyone with him, could see that the resort was nowhere near done. Buildings were empty, beamways were half finished. The hotels were far from complete. By this point, it was midsummer, and the resort was scheduled to open in early fall. As they rolled back to the roundhouse, passing construction crews in Tomorrowland, the Disney people in the monorail could feel the pressure from a slightly different angle now. They could see it through the eyes of the governor and his people, who expected that the resort would be closer to finished, that it would look more like the artwork they had seen on TV and in the paper. They could feel the pressure building. Roy Disney, Dick Nunis, and others. Opening day for the resort was T-minus 80 days and counting. They also knew this. For the next 11 weeks, every minute mattered. I'll be back next Sunday to continue our story about the grand opening of Walt Disney World. I'll also add in some shorter midweek episodes into our October schedule to discuss the new restaurants, nighttime spectaculars, and attractions, all of which have just opened at the Florida Resort for its 50th anniversary. If you enjoy this podcast, if you find these episodes a meaningful part of your week, please support us by becoming a monthly subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. I'll be back soon. And until then, this is Todd James Pierce.